How do people survive winter 1,000 years ago? We flip a switch. We turn a dial. Warmth is a given. But for most of human history, staying warm was a full-time job. It was a matter of life and death. The average temperature in Europe during the Little Ice Age, which started in the late medieval period, was about 1 to 2 degrees Celsius colder than today. That does not sound like much. But it was enough to cause crop failures, famines, and widespread misery. So, how do they do it? How did a peasant in a drafty hut or a lord in a stone castle make it to spring? They were not helpless. They were masters of a low-tech, high-skill world of warmth. They used physics, biology, and community in ways we have forgotten. They understood heat in their bones, not just in theory. Their solutions were woven into their homes, their clothes, and their daily lives. What can their world teach us about our own? Number 16, could a simple box of coals kill you? People needed a way to move heat around. The main fireplace was often in a great hall. It was a central point. But rooms were far apart. Bedrooms were cold. A stone castle does not hold heat well. So they used a simple tool, the brazier. A brazier was a metal container. It held hot coals. It was basically a portable heater. You could carry it from room to room. You could place it in the center of a group of people. The wealthy had ornate braziers. They were made of bronze or brass. They had fancy legs and decorations. The poor used simpler containers. A sturdy pottery bowl could work, or a basic iron pan. The fuel was charcoal, not wood. Burning wood indoors without a chimney fills a room with smoke. Charcoal is wood that has already been burned in a low oxygen environment. It burns hotter and cleaner than wood. It glows red. It does not produce much smoke. The heat from a brazier is radiant heat. Think of the sun. It warms your face even on a cold day. The heat travels in invisible waves. It warms objects directly. It warms people. It warms furniture. It does not heat the air very much. This is an efficient way to feel warm in a specific spot. You huddle around the brazier. The side of you facing the coals gets warm. The other side stays cold. So people would turn like they were on a spit. It was a small circle of comfort in a large, cold room. Records from medieval households show payments for charcoal. This was a regular winter expense. Archaeological digs find remnants of braziers in castles and Roman villas alike. The technology was ancient. The Romans used them extensively. The famous bronze braziers found in Pompeii, preserved by the ash of Vesuvius in 79 AD, show how long this simple idea has been around. But there's a dark side. Of brazier as a fire hazard. A stray spark could ignite rushes on the floor, or a tapestry on the wall. And there was a more silent, invisible danger: carbon monoxide. When charcoal burns, it needs oxygen. In a well-ventilated room, it burns completely. It produces carbon dioxide, but in a sealed, stuffy room, there is not enough oxygen. The charcoal burns incompletely. It produces carbon monoxide, or CO. You cannot see it. You cannot smell it. It is a ghost. It enters your lungs. It gets into your blood. It binds to your hemoglobin, the part of your red blood cells that carries oxygen. It binds over 200 times more strongly than oxygen does. So it kicks oxygen out. Your blood keeps circulating, but it is carrying a poison instead of life. Your body starts to suffocate from the inside out. The first signs are a headache, then dizziness, nausea, confusion. You feel sleepy. If you fall asleep in a room with a running brazier, you might never wake up. How many medieval unexplained deaths were just carbon monoxide poisoning? We will never know. People probably knew about the danger in a practical way. They talked about bad air. They knew you needed to keep a window cracked open. They knew not to sleep in a small, sealed room with a burning brazier, but accidents must have happened. A winter storm might force you to seal every crack. A person might fall asleep by accident. The physician and scientist John Scott Haldane, working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, did extensive research on carbon monoxide. He exposed himself to it to study its effects. His work explained the science behind the silent killer that medieval people only knew as a mysterious danger of winter. Or they were playing with fire, and with a chemical threat they could not even name. What do we still not know? How many people actually died from this? Without modern forensic science, a death by carbon monoxide would look like a peaceful death in one's sleep. We have no way to count the bodies. Did the constant low-level exposure to carbon monoxide in poorly ventilated homes have long-term health effects, like brain damage or heart problems, that they just accepted as part of life? And did different types of charcoal, made from different woods, produce different levels of CO, creating a hidden hierarchy of risk that people understood only through deadly trial and error? Number 15 was your better room within a room. Sleep is when you are most vulnerable to the cold. You are not moving, your body's metabolism slows down. A cold room can suck the heat right out of you. In medieval times, bedrooms were not the private, cozy sanctuaries we think of today. They were often large, drafty, and semi-public spaces. A lord and lady might have a private chamber, but servants often slept in the same room or just outside. For a peasant family, everyone slept in the same 1 or 2 rooms of their hut. The solution was not to heat the entire room. That was impossible. The solution was to create a tiny, warm micro-environment. They did this with the bed. The 4-poster bed was not just for decoration. It was a serious piece of thermal technology. It was a small room inside a larger room. Thick, heavy curtains hung from the frame. These curtains were often made of wool, which is an excellent insulator. At night, you would draw the curtains completely shut. This trapped a small pocket of air around you. Your own body heat, and the heat of anyone else in the bed, would slowly warm up this pocket of air. The curtains blocked drafts. They prevented the cold air of the room from circulating around you and stealing your warmth. It was your personal cocoon. The wealthiest people had incredibly elaborate beds. The Great Bed of Ware, built around 1590, is a massive oak 4-poster bed that is over 10 feet wide. It was said to be able to sleep 4 couples. It is a famous example of how central the bed was to life. The mattress itself was also a key part of the system. It was a thick bag, usually made of canvas. What went inside depended on your wealth. The rich had mattresses stuffed with soft feathers and down. This was the ultimate luxury. Feathers trap a lot of air, making them fantastic insulators. Think of a modern down jacket. The poor used whatever they could find. Straw was common. It was cheap and readily available after the harvest. It provided a thick layer of insulation from the cold floor or bed frame. But it was also scratchy. It attracted mice and insects, and it had to be changed regularly or it would start to rot. Other mattress fillings included horsehair, wool scraps, or even dried leaves. You would sleep on top of this thick, insulating layer and cover yourself with more layers. Wool blankets were the standard. Furs were used by those who could afford them. A wolf or bearskin rug was not just a trophy. It was a lifesaver in January. Even the act of sleeping was different. People often slept propped up on several pillows. You see this in old paintings. They look like they are sitting up in bed. There were a couple of reasons for this. One was a fear of apoplexy, what we might call a stroke. They believed that lying flat could cause blood to rush to the head. But it also had a thermal benefit. When you are propped up, you can pull the covers up to your nose. You can create a little breathing hole. Your warm breath stays under the covers with you, helping to warm the air in your bed tent. And you did not sleep alone. CO sleeping was the norm, not just with a spouse. Children slept with their parents. Servants might sleep on a truckle bed, a small bed on wheels that was stored under the main bed during the day. Huddling together shared body heat. It was a simple biological way to stay warm. A study published in the journal Physiology and Behavior in 2007 confirmed what medieval people knew: sleeping next to someone reduces the metabolic energy your body needs to spend on staying warm. So, what are the unanswered questions here? We know what beds were made of, but how did they smell? A straw mattress filled with sweat, skin flakes, and insects covered by unwashed wool blankets in a sealed, airless, curtained bed. What was the microbial world living in that bed with you? Did the constant lack of fresh air inside the bed curtains contribute to the spread of respiratory illnesses? We think of disease spreading in crowds, but what if the most dangerous place was your own bed? And psychologically, what was it like to spend a third of your life in a dark, stuffy, enclosed box? Number 14, could a carpet hang on a wall? Walk into a medieval castle in your mind. You see stone, gray, cold, hard stone. The walls are thick, they are meant to stop an army, but they are terrible at stopping the cold. Stone has a high thermal mass. That means it takes a lot of energy to heat it up. And it feels cold to the touch because it pulls heat away from your body very quickly. A bare stone wall in winter radiates cold, it makes the entire room feel like a refrigerator. You could have a huge fire roaring in the fireplace, but if you stood near a wall, you would still feel a chill. They needed to insulate their walls. They did not have fiberglass bats or foam panels. They used fabric. Tapestries were the medieval equivalent of insulation. These were not just decorations. They were a critical part of a castle's climate control system. A large, thick woolen tapestry hung against a stone wall created a layer of still air between the fabric and the stone. This trapped air acted as an insulator. It broke the thermal bridge, preventing the cold from the stone from radiating into the room. It also stopped drafts that came through cracks in the mortar. The difference in comfort was huge. A room with tapestries felt warmer and cozier. It was a technology of comfort. This is why you see them in paintings of medieval interiors. They were a sign of wealth, yes. They were incredibly expensive. A single tapestry could cost as much as a warship. The famous The Hunt of the Unicorn tapestries, made around 1500, are a stunning example of the artistry and expense involved. They were woven with wool, silk, and even silver and gold threads, but the function was just as important as the form. The wool fibers themselves are natural insulators. The structure of wool traps air. The sheer thickness of the tapestry added to its insulating power, what we would now call its R value. A study by the National Research Council of Canada found that even a simple fabric wall hanging can reduce a wall's heat loss by over 25%. A thick medieval tapestry would have been even more effective, and they were practical. In the summer, you could take them down, beat the dust out of them, and store them. This also allowed you to air out the walls and prevent mildew from growing behind them. They were a flexible seasonal solution. Even less wealthy households used wall hangings. They might not be fancy pictorial tapestries. They might be simpler woven fabrics called dorsers or hanged cloths. Sometimes they were painted with patterns to look like tapestries. Even a simple piece of heavy cloth was better than a bare wall. Paneling a room with wood was another option for the rich. Wood is a much better insulator than stone. A wood-paneled room like the famous oak room from a 15th century English home now in the Minneapolis Institute of Art was a permanent and effective way to fight the cold. It created a warmer surface and an air gap, just like a tapestry. It was a sign of status, a way of showing you could afford to be comfortable. But this raises some questions. Tapestries and wall hangings would have been a paradise for pests. Moths, mice, and rats could live behind them, safe and hidden. How did they deal with the infestations? Beating the tapestries was one way, but was it enough? And what about fire? A room lined with dry wood and heavy fabric, lit by candles and a fireplace, seems like a death trap. How common were house fires, and how quickly could a whole room be engulfed in flames because of its own insulation? Finally, we see tapestries in the halls of the rich. What did the poor do? Did they hang animal skins or old blankets on their wattle and daub walls? Or did they simply live with the chilling cold radiating from all sides? Number 13. Did they throw garbage on the floor to stay warm? The floor of a medieval building was often just packed earth, stone flags, or rough wooden planks. Like, all of these are cold. A cold floor will suck the heat right out of your feet. This is conduction. Heat moves from a warmer object to a colder object through direct contact. Your 98.6 degree body is constantly losing heat to a 40-degree stone floor. This can make you feel cold all over, even if the air is warm. So, they covered their floors. Now with wall-to-wall carpeting, that did not exist yet. They used loose, natural materials. The most common floor covering was rushes. These are long, grass-like plants that grow in marshy areas. They would be harvested in the summer, dried, and then spread in a thick layer across the floor. This layer could be several inches deep. It was like a natural disposable carpet. The rushes provided a softer, warmer surface to walk on. The structure of the dried plants trapped thousands of tiny air pockets. This layer of trapped air was the key. It acted as an insulator, breaking the conductive link between your feet and the cold stone or earth beneath. It was a simple, cheap, and surprisingly effective form of insulation. The Dutch scholar Erasmus, writing in the 16th century, described English floors. He was not impressed. He complained that the rushes were often left for years. The top layer was fresh, but underneath was a vile mix of spittle, vomit, the urine of dogs and men, ale droppings, scraps of fish, and other abominations not fit to be mentioned. This description gives us a clue. The rushes were not just for warmth, they were also for sanitation in a strange way. People threw their scraps and trash right onto the floor. The rushes absorbed the mess. When it got too smelly or gross, they would just add a new layer of fresh rushes on top. This created a kind of compost pile on the floor of the house. This biological activity might have generated a tiny amount of heat. A well-managed compost pile can reach temperatures of 130 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. The floor of a medieval hall was probably not that active, but a slow, low-level decomposition could have created a small amount of warmth from below. The 2011 book, Life in a Medieval Castle by Joseph and Francis G. supports this idea of layered history on the floor, though the heat generation is more speculative. The wealthy had more pleasant options. They might use sweet-smelling herbs mixed in with the rushes. Lavender, chamomile, and meadowsweet would release a pleasant scent when walked on. This helped to cover up the other smells. In the richest households, they might use woven mats or imported carpets. But even they use rushes in less important rooms. Furs were another option. A bearskin or wolfskin rug in front of the hearth was a common sight in a lord's hall. It provided a luxurious warm spot to sit or stand. The fur, like wool, is an excellent insulator. It is designed by nature to keep an animal warm, and it worked just as well for humans. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Viking settlement at Lance Os Meadows in Newfoundland shows how floor coverings were used to insulate turf houses from the cold ground. But we have to wonder about the health implications. What kind of bacteria, molds, and viruses were thriving in that layered, rotting floor covering that Erasmus described. So was it a breeding ground for disease? How many infections were caused by people living on top of their own filth? And could the constant smell have had psychological effects? We know that smells can strongly affect mood. What did a medieval house truly smell like in the dead of winter? And how did it shape the people who lived inside? And did they ever do a full deep clean, shoveling out years of accumulated rushes and filth, or did the layers just keep getting deeper and deeper over generations? Number 12, why was winter the season for huddling? Heat comes from within. The human body is a furnace. It is constantly burning calories to maintain a core temperature of around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 Celsius. This process is called thermoregulation. A single, stationary person generates about 100 watts of heat. That is the same as a bright incandescent light bulb. In a large, drafty medieval room, that heat dissipates quickly. It is lost to the cold air and colder walls, but what if you bring several of those 100-watt heaters together? The effect is multiplied. This is the simple physics behind huddling. In medieval life, there was very little concept of personal space as we know it. Privacy was a luxury few could afford or even imagine. People lived, worked, and slept in close proximity. This was partly due to the size of their homes. A peasant family of 6 or 8 might live in a single-room hut. But it was also a survival strategy. In winter, this closeness was a source of shared warmth. Families would huddle together around the fire. They would sleep together in the same bed. Sharing body heat was a free and effective way to fight the cold. The 2014 study and proceedings of the Royal Society B on thermoregulation in emperor penguins shows how effective huddling is. Penguins in a huddle can reduce their individual heat loss by 50%. The physics is the same for people. By reducing the amount of your body's surface area that is exposed to the cold air, you conserve heat. This communal warmth extended beyond the family. The Great Hall of a castle was the social and thermal center of life. The lord, his family, his knights, and his servants would all gather there. A huge fire would blaze in a central hearth. The sheer number of bodies in the room would raise the temperature. Think of a crowded concert or a packed subway car. It gets warm quickly. A medieval feast in the Great Hall was not just a meal. It was a way to generate collective heat. And it was not just people. Animals were a key part of the heating system for many families. In a typical peasant longhouse, the family lived at one end and their livestock lived at the other. There might be a simple partition or no partition at all. A cow is a very large, warm-blooded animal. A cow's body temperature is around 101.5 degrees Fahrenheit. It generates a significant amount of heat, roughly 1,000 watts, 10 times that of a human. Having your cow, your ox, and a few sheep in the same building as you was like having several large, furry space heaters. The smell must have been incredible. But in the middle of a freezing night, The warmth from the animals could be the difference between comfort and misery, or even life and death. This practice is well documented in archaeological reconstructions of medieval farmsteads, like the one at the Wealden Downland Living Museum in England. They show the integrated living spaces for humans and animals, so this constant togetherness had a clear thermal benefit. But what did it cost? What are the psychological effects of having absolutely no privacy ever? When you are never truly alone, does your sense of self change? How did they handle conflicts and tensions when they were literally forced to be on top of each other for months on end? And on a practical level, how did the close proximity to animals affect human health? We know many diseases can jump from animals to humans, a process called zoonosis. Were medieval peasants healthier because of the warmth or sicker because of the germs? Number 11, could you drink yourself warm? Feeling cold comes from the inside out. Your body needs fuel to generate heat. In the medieval period, the winter diet changed. It became heavier, richer, and hotter. Food was not just for sustenance. It was a tool for thermoregulation. The concept was simple: eat hot, heavy foods, and your body will feel warmer. The centerpiece of the medieval diet, especially for the poor, was pottage. This was a thick stew or porridge constantly simmering over the fire. It could contain grains like oats or barley, vegetables like onions and cabbage, and if you were lucky, some scraps of meat or bacon for flavor. It was a one-pot meal that was warm, filling, and calorie-dense. Eating a hot bowl of pottage would raise your core body temperature directly. The calories themselves were even more important. The process of digesting food generates heat. This is called diet-induced thermogenesis. Your body has to work to break down food, and this work creates warmth. Fats and proteins have a higher thermic effect than carbohydrates, so a winter diet rich in fatty meats, cheese, and bread was a way to stoke the internal furnace. Feasting in the winter was common for the wealthy. A Christmas feast was not just a celebration. It was a way to load up on calories for the cold months ahead. The amount of food consumed was staggering. The records from the household of an English bishop in 1299 show that on a single feast day, they consumed several oxen, pigs, sheep, and hundreds of birds. This was fuel. Spices also played a role. The spice trade was a massive part of the medieval economy. Spices like pepper, ginger, cloves, and cinnamon were expensive and desirable. We think of them as flavorings. But they were also seen as having medicinal and warming properties. The medieval theory of medicine was based on the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each was associated with a quality: hot, cold, wet, or dry. Winter was a cold and wet season. So to stay healthy, you needed to consume things that were hot and dry. Spices like ginger and pepper were considered hot. They were added to food and drinks to counteract the cold of winter. There is some science to this. Certain spices like capsaicin and chili peppers, which were not available in Europe yet, or piperine and black pepper, can slightly increase metabolism and create a sensation of warmth. And then there was alcohol. Ale and beer were staples of the medieval diet for everyone, including children. Water was often unsafe to drink, but the brewing process killed pathogens. Ale was a major source of calories. A thick, hearty medieval ale was more like liquid bread. Wine was more common for the wealthy and in southern Europe. Alcohol makes you feel warm. It causes the blood vessels in your skin to dilate, a process called vasodilation. This brings warm blood to the surface of your skin, which makes your skin feel hot. But this is a dangerous illusion. By bringing warm blood to the surface, you are actually losing core body heat to the environment much faster. A drink of ale might make you feel toasty for a few minutes, but it is ultimately making you colder. A 2005 study in the Journal of Wilderness Medicine confirmed that alcohol consumption significantly increases the risk of hypothermia in cold environments. Medieval people felt the short-term warmth. They probably did not understand the long-term danger. This brings up some difficult questions. With a diet heavy in ale and beer, how widespread was low-level functional alcoholism? Did the warming effect of alcohol lead to more deaths from hypothermia as people felt warm while their core temperatures were dropping dangerously low? And did the reliance on heavy, fatty foods for winter warmth contribute to health problems like heart disease, or was their physically demanding lifestyle enough to burn off all those extra calories? Number 10. Why would you block out the sun in winter? Windows are holes in your house. They let in light, but they also let out a massive amount of heat. In the medieval period, windows were a weak point in the thermal envelope of a building. For the vast majority of people, a window was not a pane of glass. It was just an opening in the wall. You needed it for light and ventilation, but it was also a major source of drafts and heat loss. To combat this, they used simple, practical solutions. The most common window was a wooden shutter. These were solid pieces of wood that could be closed and barred at night or during a storm. Closing the shutters was the first line of defense against the cold. A solid shutter provided a barrier against the wind. It also created a small air gap between the shutter and the opening, which added a bit of insulation. It plunged the room into darkness, but at night that did not matter. In a peasant's hut, the windows were often just small slits, not much wider than an arrow slit in a castle. This minimized the area for heat to escape. For those who could afford something better, there were other options. One was to use oiled paper or linen. A piece of linen cloth, stretched on a wooden frame and soaked in linseed oil, would become translucent. It let in a dim, diffused light, but it blocked the wind. It was not transparent like glass, but it was better than an open hole. It was a medieval version of a frosted window. Another option was to use thinly sliced pieces of horn. Animal horn could be heated and flattened into thin, yellowish, semi-transparent panes. These were more durable than oiled linen. They were often used in lanterns, but also for small windows. So both of these solutions were better than nothing, but they were still poor insulators. A 2012 study from the University of Cambridge on the energy efficiency of historic buildings highlighted that single glazed windows, which are far superior to oiled linen or horn, are the single biggest source of heat loss in an old building. Glass was the ultimate luxury. Glass making was a difficult and expensive process. Medieval glass was not the perfectly clear flat glass we have today. It was often bubbly, uneven, and greenish in color. It was made in small pieces, which were then held together with lead strips to make a larger window. This is the origin of stained glass windows in churches. A glass window was a huge status symbol. It meant you were rich enough to afford light without the cold. But even a glass window was a terrible insulator. It was a single pane. Heat flowed through it easily, but it was the best technology they had. Only the wealthiest lords and merchants could afford glass windows in their private homes. King Henry III of England was one of the first monarchs to install glass windows in his palaces in the 13th century, and it was considered a remarkable innovation. So the daily routine in winter involved managing the windows carefully. You would open the shutters during the day to let in whatever sunlight you could. This passive solar gain would help to warm the room. As soon as the sun started to go down, you would close the shutters tight to trap any warmth inside for the night. It was a constant battle between the need for light and the need for warmth. What are the lingering questions? How much did the lack of natural light in winter affect people's mental health? We know about seasonal affective disorder SAD today, linked to a lack of sunlight. Was this a widespread, unnamed misery in the medieval world? Did the constant dimness inside their homes affect their eyesight over time? And could the materials they used to cover windows, like oiled linen, have released unhealthy fumes into the air when they were warmed by the sun? Number 9, did people abandon their own homes in winter? A big room is hard to heat. The larger the volume of air, the more energy it takes to raise its temperature. A medieval great hall was a perfect example of this problem. It was huge, it had a high ceiling, it was designed to impress, but it was a thermal nightmare. You could have a fire big enough to roast an ox, and the corners of the room would still be freezing. The heat from the fire would rise straight up to the ceiling, leaving the people on the floor in the cold. So people in large houses and castles used a simple strategy. They moved. During the summer, they lived in the large, airy public rooms. The Great Hall was the center of life, but in the winter, the household would often retreat to smaller, more defensible rooms. These rooms were easier to heat. A lord and his family might move into their private chambers called a solar. This was a room, often on an upper floor, that was smaller than the Great Hall. It would have its own fireplace. Because the room was smaller, a modest fire could make it feel quite cozy. The term solar comes from the fact that these rooms often face south to catch the winter sun. The architectural design of castles and manor houses from the period, such as Stokesay Castle in Shropshire, clearly shows this division between the large public hall and the smaller private solar. This was a form of architectural zoning for climate control. This retreat into smaller quarters was a practical response to the high cost of fuel. Wood was not free, it had to be cut, hauled, and seasoned. This took time and labor. A lord had to manage his woodlands carefully to ensure a sustainable supply of firewood for his castle. By closing off large parts of the house and living in a smaller area, you could conserve a huge amount of fuel. The household would essentially hibernate in a small warm core of the building. This is a strategy we still use today. People close vents in unused rooms or turn down the thermostat in parts of the house they are not using. The medieval version was just more extreme. Even peasants in their small huts practiced this. A family might spend most of their waking hours crowded into the one area of the hut closest to the hearth. The rest of the space was left cold. It was about creating a small zone of comfort in a larger, colder structure. The whole concept of the house changed with the seasons. In summer, it was an open, flowing space. In winter, it was a sealed, compartmentalized bunker. The use of heavy curtains or arras to divide large rooms into smaller spaces was also common. You could hang a curtain to create a small room around a fireplace, trapping the heat in a smaller area. This seasonal migration within the home is a fascinating adaptation, but it leaves us with some questions. What happened to the large, abandoned rooms during the winter? Did they become damp, moldy, and filled with pests? How difficult was it to reopen the house in the spring? And did this forced proximity in smaller rooms for months on end lead to increased social friction and conflict within the household? When the lord and his family were cooped up in one room for all of winter, did tempers flare more easily? Number 8. How do you get into a warm bed? You have your 4-poster bed with the curtains drawn. You have your straw or feather mattress and your wool blankets. But the bed itself is cold. The sheets, if you had them, were linen. Linen feels cool to the touch. Getting into a cold bed on a freezing night is a miserable experience. The cold sheets suck the warmth right out of you. You have to shiver for a long time before your own body heat warms up your little cocoon. The medieval solution was simple and brilliant. They warmed the bed before they got into it. They used a tool called a warming pan. A warming pan was a metal container with a long handle. It looked like a covered frying pan. The container part was usually made of copper or brass. It had a hinged lid, often with holes punched in it for decoration and to let out a little steam. The process was simple. You would take hot coals from the fireplace and put them inside the pan. Then you would close the lid. You would take the pan by its long handle and run it between the sheets of the bed. You would move it back and forth to distribute the heat and make sure you did not scorch the linen. The hot metal pan would warm the sheets and the mattress. After a few minutes, you would take the warming pan out. The bed would be wonderfully, luxuriously warm. It was the medieval equivalent of an electric blanket. Warming pans were common items in any household that could afford one. They appear in household inventories and wills from the period. The design changed very little over several centuries. The long handle was important. It let you reach all corners of the bed without having to lean over too much. It also kept you at a safe distance from the hot coals. This was a job for a servant if you had one. Part of the nightly ritual was to warm the master's bed. For those without a fancy metal warming pan, there were simpler methods. A hot stone or a brick could be heated in the fire. You would wrap it in a piece of cloth to prevent it from burning the bedclothes. Then you would place it in the bed. It acted like a primitive hot water bottle. The stone would slowly release its heat over several hours, providing a source of warmth at the foot of the bed all night. This was a common trick for centuries. Archaeologists sometimes find smooth, fire-cracked stones in the hearts of medieval homes, and these may well have been used for bed warming. This simple technology made a huge difference to comfort. It was a small act of domestic luxury that made the harshness of winter a little more bearable. It shows a real focus on the details of daily life. Staying warm was not just about grand solutions like a huge fireplace. It was also about small, clever tricks to improve your immediate environment. The science is straightforward heat transfer. The hot pan transfers its thermal energy to the cold sheets through conduction. The fact that this simple tool was so widespread shows how universal the problem of a cold bed was. The writer Samuel Pepys mentions his warming pan in his famous diary from the 17th century, showing its enduring popularity. But this practice also had its dangers. What if a few hot embers fell out of the pan and onto the straw mattress? A bed could catch fire in seconds. How many bed fires were caused by this nightly ritual? And what about the fumes? Putting hot coals into a metal pan could release a puff of carbon monoxide. Was doing this every night in a closed-off bedroom a health risk? And for the people using a hot stone, how did they avoid burning themselves? A stone hot enough to stay warm for hours could cause a serious burn if your foot touched it in the middle of the night. Number 7. How important was a good hat? The key to staying warm is to not get cold in the first place. And the best way to do that is to wear the right clothes. Medieval clothing was not about fashion in the way we think of it. It was about survival. The materials they used and the way they wore them were the result of centuries of experience in dealing with the cold. The principle was layering. Not one thick, heavy garment, but several thinner layers. This was a sophisticated and effective system. The layer closest to the skin was usually linen. Linen is made from the flax plant. It is comfortable and absorbent. It was the underwear of the Middle Ages. A man would wear a linen shirt and linen breeches. A woman would wear a linen chemise, a long shift. Linen is not a great insulator, especially when wet, but it was easy to wash, much easier than wool. So it kept the outer, more valuable layers cleaner. Over the linen, you wore wool, and wool was the miracle fiber of the medieval world. It was a technology in itself. Wool fibers have a natural crimp. This creates millions of tiny air pockets. Trapped air is the key to all insulation. It is this trapped air that keeps you warm. A wool garment like a tunic or a gown was a wearable layer of insulation. But wool has another amazing property. It can absorb a lot of moisture, up to 30% of its own weight, without feeling wet. And it stays warm even when it is damp. This is because as wool absorbs water vapor, a chemical reaction takes place that releases a small amount of heat. This is called heat absorption. This property was vital in the damp, cold climate of Northern Europe. A person working outside would sweat. In a cotton garment, that sweat would make you cold and clammy. In a wool garment, the moisture is wicked away from the skin and the wool itself stays warm. This is why modern high-performance outdoor gear is often still made of merino wool. The science confirms what medieval peasants knew from experience. A 2012 study in the Textile Research Journal detailed the superior thermal properties of wool in damp conditions compared to cotton and synthetics. People wore multiple layers of wool. A man might wear a tunic and then a longer, heavier over-tunic on top. A woman would wear a gown and then another gown over that. In the winter, these outer garments would be lined with fur if you could afford it. Squirrel and rabbit were common. The very wealthy used ermine or sable. Fur is another natural insulator designed to keep an animal warm in the winter. A fur-lined cloak was a personal, portable shelter. Everyone wore a hat or a hood. The old saying that you lose most of your heat through your head is a myth, but you do lose heat from any part of your body that is uncovered. A woolen coif or a hood was essential for staying warm. They also wore woolen stockings or hose to keep their legs warm, and simple leather shoes, often stuffed with straw or moss for extra insulation. Sumptuary laws like those passed in England under King Edward III in 1337 tried to regulate who could wear what fabrics and furs. This shows how closely clothing was linked to social status, but for everyone, the basic principles of layering with wool were the same. So what do we not know? We know what they wore, but how did they keep it clean? Washing woolen garments is difficult. It is likely that most people's clothes were rarely washed. What did they smell like? And what kind of skin diseases and pests like lice and fleas were a constant problem in these unwashed, heavy layers? And psychologically, what was the effect of wearing the same heavy, bulky, and probably scratchy clothes day after day for the entire winter? Did it contribute to a feeling of sluggishness and depression during the dark months? Number 6. Was it better to be a lord or a peasant in winter? The design of a building is its primary defense against the weather. Medieval architecture was a direct response to the climate. The materials and methods they used were all about creating a shelter that could be kept warm, or at least survivable, in the winter. The differences between a castle and a peasant's hut were vast, but some of the underlying principles were the same. A castle was a fortress of stone. Stone is a terrible insulator, so castles were cold, but they were built to last. The most important feature for warmth was the thickness of the walls. A castle wall could be 10 feet thick or more. This thickness gave the walls a high thermal mass. This is a double-edged sword. In the autumn, as the weather turns cold, the stone walls slowly release the heat they have stored up over the summer. This can keep the interior a little warmer for a while, but once the walls get cold, they stay cold. It takes a huge amount of energy to warm them up again. The small windows, designed for defense, also help to reduce heat loss. As we saw, they were a major weak point, but making them small and few in number was a key design choice. The central layout of a castle, with rooms built around a protected courtyard, also helped to create a more sheltered microclimate inside the walls. The development of the wall fireplace with a chimney, which became more common from the 12th century onwards, was a huge technological leap. It allowed you to have a fire without filling the room with smoke, making it possible to heat smaller, private rooms more effectively. A peasant's hut was a completely different kind of structure. It was often made of wattle and daub. This was a wooden frame, the wattle packed with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung, the daub. This sounds primitive, but it was actually a very effective building material. It was a good insulator. A study of historic building materials by the UK Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings shows that a traditional daub wall has insulation properties comparable to modern lightweight concrete blocks. The roofs were thatched with reeds or straw. A thick thatched roof, 2 or 3 feet deep, is a fantastic insulator. It traps air and sheds water. The houses were small and low to the ground. This meant there was less surface area to lose heat and a smaller volume of air to heat inside. The floors were packed earth. The fire was an open hearth in the center of the room. There was no chimney. A hole in the roof let some of the smoke out. This sounds smoky and unpleasant, and it was. But it was also thermally efficient. All the heat from the fire was released directly into the living space. A chimney, by contrast, pulls a lot of the heat up and out of the house along with the smoke. The smoke in a peasant's hut would have blackened the walls and rafters. This soot layer might have added a tiny bit of extra insulation and draft proofing. The single small room was easy to heat with a small fire and the body heat of the family and their animals. The 1974 book, The Medieval Fenland by H.C. Darby, provides detailed descriptions of peasant life and housing, emphasizing the practical and functional nature of their homes. So, who was warmer? It is a complex question. The Lord had a fireplace, but lived in a huge, cold stone box. The peasant lived in a smoky, smelly, one-room hut, but it was smaller, better insulated, and shared with heat-producing animals. The peasant's hut was probably more consistently not freezing than many parts of the Lord's castle. This leads to some interesting unknowns. Did the constant smoke inhalation in peasant huts lead to widespread respiratory problems and a shorter life expectancy? We know from studying skeletal remains that this was a real issue. Did the dampness of stone castles cause a different set of health problems for the wealthy, like arthritis and rheumatism? And which type of building was actually more energy efficient when you consider the amount of fuel burned per person to achieve a basic level of comfort? Number 5, how did you keep your feet from freezing? The human body is smart. When it gets cold, it tries to protect the vital organs in your core. It does this by reducing blood flow to your extremities, your hands, your nose, and especially your feet. This is called vasoconstriction. It keeps your core warm, but it means your feet get cold very quickly. Cold feet can make your whole body feel cold. So keeping your feet warm was a priority. The first step was shoes. Medieval shoes were not the sturdy, waterproof boots we have today. For most people, they were simple turn shoes made of leather. The leather was sewn together inside out and then turned the right way. This created a simple, soft shoe. They did not have thick, separate soles. They were more like leather socks. They offered some protection from sharp objects, but they were not very warm and they were not at all waterproof. In wet or snowy weather, your feet would get soaked in cold almost immediately. To combat this, people would stuff their shoes with insulators. Straw, moss, or scraps of wool could be packed into the shoe around the foot. This created a layer of trapped air and helped to keep the foot warmer and a little drier. A second type of footwear was the patten. These were overshoes. They were a wooden sole, often with leather straps to attach them to your regular shoes. You would wear pattens to walk through the muddy, wet streets of a medieval town. The wooden sole raised your feet a few inches above the muck and cold ground. This kept your leather shoes cleaner and drier. It was a simple but effective piece of technology for dealing with a cold, wet environment. patterns appear frequently in medieval art, like the famous Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck from 1434, where a pair is clearly visible on the floor. Inside the house, you did not want to walk on the cold stone or earth floors with just your thin leather shoes. People would have worn thicker stockings or socks made of wool. For the wealthy, there were also soft, fur-lined slippers for indoor wear. The combination of rush-covered floors and warm indoor footwear made a big difference. Keeping your feet off the cold ground was the main goal. This is why chairs were important. Sitting on a chair or a bench with your feet on a footstool was much warmer than sitting on the floor. Even a simple three-legged stool was a piece of thermal equipment. It got your body off the cold ground. The importance of keeping feet warm is rooted in our physiology. A 2005 study at the Common Cold Center at Cardiff University found that chilling a person's feet made them more likely to develop cold symptoms. So the medieval focus on warm feet was also a way to stay healthy. But what don't we know about this? How common was frostbite? With their inadequate footwear, a long journey in the snow or a day spent working in a wet field could have had devastating consequences. Did people lose toes or even feet to the cold on a regular basis? What were the long-term effects of constantly having cold, damp feet? Did it lead to chronic problems like trench foot, fungal infections, or arthritis? And how did they dry their wet leather shoes? Placing them too close to the fire would make the leather shrink and crack. A wet pair of shoes in winter could be a serious problem that lasted for days. Number 4, did sunlight have a timetable? The sun is the ultimate source of heat. Even on a cold winter day, a beam of sunlight coming through a window can feel warm on your skin. This is passive solar heating. It is the simplest and most ancient form of climate control. Medieval people understood this intuitively. They used the sun's energy to their advantage, both in their daily routines and in the design of their buildings. The daily schedule was dictated by the sun. In winter, the days are short. You had to make the most of the available light and warmth. People would rise with the sun and go to bed not long after it set. There was no cheap, effective artificial lighting. Candles were expensive. Rushlights made by dipping a dried rush in fat gave off a smoky, dim light. The best source of light and heat was the sun, so work was done during daylight hours. Whenever possible, that work would be done in a sunny spot. A woman might move her spinning wheel to a spot near a south-facing window. A man might choose a sunny, sheltered spot out of the wind to mend a tool. People would actively seek out patches of sunlight to warm themselves. You can imagine people taking breaks from their work to simply stand in the sun for a few minutes soaking in the warmth. The orientation of buildings was also important. Whenever possible, a house would be built to take advantage of the sun. A longhouse was often oriented on an east-west axis. The main door and windows would be on the south-facing side. This allowed the low winter sun to shine into the building for most of the day. The north side, which gets no direct sun in the winter and faces the coldest winds, would have few or no openings. This is a basic principle of passive solar design that architects still use today. The monastic cloisters of the medieval period are a perfect example. A cloister is a covered walkway around a quadrangle. It was almost always built on the south side of the main church. This meant that the walkway was sunny and sheltered from the north wind, providing a warm place for the monks to walk and study during the day. The design of Reavox Abbey in Yorkshire, founded in 1132, shows this careful solar orientation. This use of the sun was a free and limitless source of heat. It required no fuel. It just required careful planning and an awareness of the sun's daily and seasonal paths. This knowledge was part of the common sense of the time. They understood that the sun was lower in the sky in winter, and they designed their buildings and their lives around that fact. A 2018 study in the journal Energy in Buildings analyzed the passive solar design of historic buildings and found them to be surprisingly sophisticated, maximizing solar gain in winter while often providing shading in the summer. But there are things we can only guess at. How precisely did they plan the orientation of their buildings? Did they use solar alignments, or was it just a matter of general folk wisdom? Did the constant need to chase the sun create a different psychological relationship with daylight than we have today? Was the setting of the sun a moment of real anxiety, marking the beginning of the long, cold, dark night? And how did they cope on a series of cloudy, sunless days in the middle of winter? Was that when the cold really became a life-threatening enemy? Number 3 was staying still, the quickest way to freeze. Your body is a furnace, and like any furnace, it can be turned up. The best way to generate more body heat is to move. Physical activity requires your muscles to burn fuel. A major byproduct of this process is heat. When you are cold, your body does this automatically. You shiver. Shivering is your muscles contracting and relaxing very quickly. It is an involuntary way to generate heat, but you can also do it voluntarily by being active. Medieval life was physically demanding. For most people, there was no choice but to be active. A peasant's life was one of constant labor. In the winter, there was still work to be done. You had to chop wood, fetch water, muck out the animals, and mend tools. This work kept you warm. The heat you generated through your own labor was a primary source of warmth. You did not stand around getting cold, you worked. A study published in the Journal of Applied Physiology shows that even moderate exercise can increase your body's heat production by 5 times compared to when you are resting. Strenuous exercise can increase it by 10 times or more. Even the nobility, who did not have to do manual labor, had ways of staying warm through activity. Hunting was a popular winter pastime for the aristocracy. A day spent riding, walking, and chasing game was a good way to stay warm. They also practiced archery and swordsmanship. These were not just military skills. They were also a form of exercise. Indoor games could also be active. An early form of tennis was played indoors. Ear dancing was a common feature of any feast or celebration. A lively dance in the Great Hall would get everyone's blood pumping and raise the temperature of the room. For children, play was the way to stay warm. They would be sent outside to run, play games, and burn off energy. Famous 1565 painting, The Hunters in the Snow by Peter Bruegel the Elder. You can see people engaged in all sorts of winter activities. The hunters are trudging through the snow. In the background, people are ice skating on a frozen pond. The painting is a vivid depiction of a community that is active, not hibernating, in the winter. They are living with the cold, not just hiding from it. This constant activity had another benefit. It kept them fit. A person with more muscle mass has a higher resting metabolic rate. This means they generate more heat even when they are not moving. So the physically demanding nature of medieval life also made people more resilient to the cold. But this raises some questions about the most vulnerable. What about the elderly, the sick, or the very young, who could not be as active? How did they stay warm? Were they simply confined to a spot next to the fire for the entire winter? And what about the trade-off between activity and calories? When you are active, you burn more calories. Food could be scarce in the winter. Was there a dangerous balancing act between moving to stay warm and conserving energy because you did not have enough to eat? And did people ever just give in to the cold and become lethargic and inactive, leading to a dangerous spiral of getting colder and moving less? Number 2 was a fireplace, a good way to heat a room. The fire is the most ancient and iconic symbol of warmth. For medieval people, the hearth was the heart of the home. It was the source of heat, the place for cooking, and the social center of the household. But was it actually an effective way to heat a room? The answer is complicated. For most of the early medieval period, the standard fire was an open hearth in the center of the room. This had some advantages. As we saw, it released all of its heat directly into the space. The radiant heat from the fire would warm the people and objects around it. And the fire was accessible from all sides, so a large group of people could gather around it. The smoke would rise and, in theory, exit through a hole in the roof. But this system had huge problems. The smoke. A room with an open hearth was constantly filled with smoke. It stung your eyes. It made you cough, and it was full of carcinogens and carbon monoxide, and the hole in the roof that let the smoke out also let the cold air in. The great technological innovation was the wall fireplace with a chimney. This began to appear in the castles of the wealthy around the 12th century and slowly became more common. A chimney is a simple but revolutionary idea. It is a flue that draws the smoke up and out of the building. This meant you could have a fire in a room without being choked by the smoke. It made it possible to have fireplaces on upper floors. It allowed for smaller, private, and much more comfortable rooms. But the fireplace was, and still is, a very inefficient heater. The draft that pulls the smoke up the chimney also pulls a huge amount of the hot air from the fire with it. Most of the heat produced by the fire goes straight up the chimney and is lost to the outside world. An open fireplace can have an efficiency of 10% or even less. That means 90% of the energy in the wood you are burning is wasted. Furthermore, the fire is constantly drawing air from the room to burn. This air has to be replaced. So cold air is pulled into the room from every crack and crevice under the door and through the windows. This creates drafts. So you have a situation where your front is roasting from the radiant heat of the fire, while your back is freezing from the cold drafts the fire is creating. The fuel cost was also enormous. A large castle would have multiple fireplaces burning all winter. This required a huge continuous supply of firewood. The logistics of the wood economy were a major part of running a large medieval estate. The book The Medieval Household by G.G. Colton details the daily fuel requirements and the labor involved in keeping a household warm. So while the fireplace was a huge improvement in terms of air quality and comfort, it was a terribly inefficient machine for heating. It was more of a people warmer than a room warmer. You had to be close to it to feel its benefit. This is why furniture was often arranged to face the fire, and it is why the area around the hearth was the most valuable social real estate in the house. This leads to some fundamental questions. Given the incredible inefficiency of the fireplace, did they ever develop techniques to improve it, like dampers or firebacks, heavy iron plates placed at the back of the fire to reflect heat? There is some evidence for this, but how widespread was it? How did the transition from the smoky open hearth to the drafty fireplace change the health of the population? Was it a trade-off between lung diseases from smoke and other illnesses caused by the cold and drafts? And did the immense demand for firewood created by inefficient fireplaces contribute to deforestation in parts of medieval Europe? Number one was the cold a choice. We look back at the medieval period and see a constant grim struggle against the cold. But did they see it the same way, or was their relationship with cold fundamentally different from ours? We live in a world of thermostats and constant uniform indoor temperatures. We have come to expect a level of thermal comfort that would have been unimaginable to them. For them, being cold in winter was not a problem to be solved. It was a fact of life. It was a normal part of the seasonal rhythm. Their bodies were likely better adapted to the cold than ours are. Constant exposure to cold can trigger physiological changes. For example, the body can increase its amount of brown fat, a special type of fat that is metabolically active and generates heat. Studies on outdoor workers and people who live in cold climates, like a 2014 study in the Journal of Clinical Investigation, show that adults can increase their brown fat through cold exposure. It is very likely that medieval people had more of this heat-generating tissue than we do. Their bodies were simply better at keeping themselves warm. Their perception of comfort was also different. They were not aiming for a steady 72 degrees. They were aiming for not dangerously cold. Their comfort zone was much wider and much lower than ours. A room that we would find unpleasantly chilly might have felt perfectly normal, or even cozy to them. This acceptance of cold was woven into their culture and their religion. Winter was a time of introspection and penitence. The physical hardship of the cold was seen by some as a spiritual discipline. It was a reminder of human frailty and dependence on God. The cold was not an enemy to be defeated by technology. It was a condition to be endured with fortitude. This mindset is a form of psychological adaptation. If you accept something as inevitable, it is easier to bear. We, with our technology, have declared war on the cold. We see it as an inconvenience, a problem that needs to be fixed. They saw it as a season, a state of being, as natural as the darkness of night. This does not mean they enjoyed being cold. They clearly used every tool and trick they had to create pockets of warmth and comfort. But their baseline was different. Their entire world was not heated, just small parts of it. They lived in a world of thermal contrasts, the intense heat next to the fire, the deep cold by the wall, the warmth of the bed, the chill of the morning air. Their lives were a constant negotiation with temperature. Ours are an attempt to eliminate it as a factor altogether. The historian Ian Mortimer, in his book The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England, emphasizes that we must try to understand their world on its own terms, not by our modern standards of comfort. This raises the most profound questions of all. By creating our perfectly controlled indoor climates, what have we lost? Have our bodies become weaker, less adaptable, and less resilient to temperature changes? Has our quest for constant comfort made us less tough, both physically and psychologically? And is it possible that the medieval experience of winter, with its clear hardships, but also its communal huddling, its reliance on the natural rhythms of the sun, and its acceptance of discomfort contained a kind of wisdom that we have forgotten.